Welcome to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council program with guest speaker, Dr. Margarita Balmaceda. I welcome Dr. Balmaceda and everyone who has joined us today. I'm Bill Reisinger, despite what it says below me, ICFRC board member and program committee chair, and I'll be host for today's program. Before we begin, ICFRC would like to acknowledge and thank its donors and sponsors for their support. Midwest One Bank, the University of Iowa's International Programs, Honors Program and Public Policy Center, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, the Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, all of ICFRC's members and donors. We also thank City Channel 4 for its support in live streaming our in-person programs and for providing access to all of ICFRC's programs along with the UI Library archives. ICFRC has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City's Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. We recognize that our home community of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The full text of our acknowledgement is on our website at icfrc.org. As we get started, I would like to cover some Zoom etiquette tips. This is the time to make sure you know where your video and audio mute and unmute buttons are. Please keep your audio and video turned off for the duration of the presentation so you do not interrupt the speaker during her remarks. Following our speaker's presentation at about 12:45, we will have a 15-minute Q&A. You will be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, we invite you to turn on your video, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Margarita Balmaceda, who will speak about Game Over, Russia, Ukraine, and the EU after the US-German agreement on Nord Stream. Margarita M. Balmaceda is a political scientist working at the intersection of international relations, the political economy of authoritarianism and democracy, and technology, with special expertise in energy politics and commodities, especially steel and the metallurgical sector in the former USSR and the EU. She has a PhD in politics from Princeton University and is professor of diplomacy and international relations at Seton Hall University. Concurrently, she heads the study group on energy materiality, infrastructure, spatiality, and power at the Hansa Wissenschaftskolleg in Germany and is an associate at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Capitalizing on her Ukrainian, Russian, Hungarian, and German skills, she has conducted extensive field research in Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Lithuania, Moldova, Hungary, Germany, and Finland. Her new book, Russian Energy Chains, The Remaking of Technopolitics from Siberia to Ukraine to the European Union, which just came out earlier this year from Columbia University Press. After setting the political stage, the book provides the written equivalent of long tracking shots that follow three major energy sources, oil, natural gas, and coal, from their beginning as molecules in Siberia until they reach customers in Europe, explaining how physics, chemistry, economics, and politics all shape the process. In the words of one reviewer, Russian Energy Chains is a tour de force. Dr. Balmaceda is currently developing a project on metallurgy, conflict, and political development, and taking courses at the World Steel Association's Steel University. Surely no one is better qualified to help us understand Nord Stream 2 and its implications. We're fortunate to have her address us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Balmaceda.
It is very exciting to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And before I bore you with my PowerPoint slides, I want to say that it means so much to you to be having this discussion exactly at this venue at the Iowa City International Relations Council and with Bill Reisinger as a host. The first reason may be surprising to you, and it has to do with the way different commodities, including but not only energy commodities, are related. My native country, Argentina, is a major grain producer. In the 1980s, there was a very, very interesting connection between those exports, relations with the Soviet Union, conducted by a very authoritarian military regime, and energy. And I think these are some nuances that perhaps you as an audience are best prepared to understand more than other audiences. But most importantly, I am tremendously excited to be having this dialogue under the sponsorship and umbrella of somebody like Bill Rasinger. I have to say that he has had many research achievements for many years in different issues. In the last years, he has contributed tremendously to our understanding of the connections between different levels of government within Russia, different subnational units and the federal government. But for me, in my life, he is best known as the person who really brought in the entire issue of the role of intra-alliance relationships within the Council of Mutual Economic Relations, Comecon, CMEA, and the Soviet Union in the energy sphere. His work in this area has been really path-breaking and very, very significant for me. And more recently, as an anonymous reviewer of my book, his comments really helped me shape the manuscript in a way that is more accessible and more useful. So I'm very, very thankful and very excited to be able to be part of this dialogue with him. I'm going to try to move to sharing my screen now. Please bear with me because I am not a technical expert, at least not in, maybe I'm a technical expert in energy, but not in PowerPoint. Okay, I think it's there, correct? Yes. So what brings us together today is Nord Stream, and in particular, Nord Stream 2. This is not a book presentation, but I want to embed our discussion today in some of the issues I discuss in the book that Bill mentioned, Russian energy chains, because as we will see, both the ways in which the technical aspects of Nord Stream interface with political issues and the way some of the issues brought up by Nord Stream interface with other commodities are issues which are really very much at the substance and at the essence of this book. So let me just spend about 2 or 3 minutes giving you a sense of what I try to do with this book, and then we will get more in detail into our discussion of Nord Stream. Let me warn you that the events that are taking place in Europe currently are moving so fast. There's so much happening in European energy now. There's an energy crunch in Europe. It's totally related to Nord Stream. It's totally related to Ukraine, to Russia, to the other commodities. But this also means that the cost we have to pay for being at such a problematic and exciting moment in European energy life is that there is no way we can cover everything. So my PowerPoints, my slides, I'm just going to flag some issues, and then hopefully we will be able to discuss them in more detail during our Q&A. So probably I will try to stay towards the shorter side in my presentation so that we can discuss more about what is going on now, which is totally related to Nord Stream, Russia, Ukraine, and those energy chains that have been occupying so much of my mind in the last years. So just a snapshot of what I try to do in this book and how natural gas, which is at the center of Nord Stream, fits in. So what I try to do in this book is both to give an overview of what we need to know technically and politically to understand the extension of Russian energy export chains, but also to understand theoretically, to theorize how actors can work together or be in conflict around these different types of energy by theorizing the differences between key fossil fuels and how those differences affect relationships around those fossil fuels. And a key element and a key motivating factor in my work here was the understanding that we cannot simply speak of villains and victims in this relationship, but that the entire energy chain really is a chain that has to do with threat and temptation, opportunity and risk, and that this opportunity and risk cannot be understood unless we look at the entire value chain. So what I try to do in this book is to understand energy not simply as supply, which has really been the center of our attention for many years, but to look at the entire process from upstream, production, midstream, transit, processing, and downstream end users, which to a general extent overlap with Siberia as the source of many of these fossil fuels, Ukraine as an important transit state and processor in many cases, and the downstream in Germany. So I tried to look at these issues within the context of those entire value chains. And in doing that, I am comparing these three fossil fuels. I compare what happens to them through their entire value chain. And in doing this, I try to have them, all fossil fuels beginning in Siberia, all transiting through Ukraine and ending up as end products in Germany. In doing this, I have three goals. One is empirical, as a person who has, as a comparative politics person, trying to understand how political systems have developed in the former Soviet Union. I'm trying to understand how the participation of key actors in those Russian energy chains has affected power relationships, both foreign policy relationships and domestic power. At the level of theory, I have tried to understand how the physical qualities of different types of energy affect what you can do with them. I think this is a very interesting aspect of this book and of this work. And historically, I'm trying to understand how the actual participation in these Russian energy chains affect political life in post-Soviet societies, both the threat involved in that participation and the opportunity that was involved there. So in doing this, I'm trying to do a lot of things. I'm trying to have an academic treatment, but also I'm trying to go beyond a purely academic book. In a single book, I am dealing with three types of energy: natural gas, oil, and coal, across the entire area, Russia, Ukraine, and the EU. And the way I manage this, the way I managed to do this in only 300 pages, 240 pages, is organizing it through the travelogue of three molecules going from Siberia to Ukraine. A lot of energy books only deal with one fossil fuel or one type of energy or one country. I covered three important areas, and it would have been unmanageable if I had not devised this idea of the molecule, and I think it has worked very well. I'm also trying to make it accessible to normal people by helping people understand the technology beyond the politics, which is something we often neglect, but I am doing it in a way that is accessible to people, both in the text and in a special glossary at the end where I explain the key technical terms. And also, hopefully, to make it useful for students by having chronologies, actors, and the technology explanation. So if I go back to the theory part of what I try to do in this book, one of the key things is how do the qualities of different types of energy affect what you can do with them. And of course, today we're talking about Nord Stream. This is a natural gas pipeline. So let me very briefly give you a snapshot of what are some of the characteristics of natural gas that make it different from other types of energy. And these characteristics are also going to affect how natural gas how relationships around natural gas, including relationships around Nord Stream 2, will develop. So if we look at natural gas as a physical molecule, which is actually 99% methane, it is a gaseous molecule lighter than air. This is going to be very important. I will get to that in a moment. You have different qualities of natural gas having to do with the methane content and with the energy content of that natural gas, but that heterogeneity of natural gas has not been at the forefront of marketing. And this is in very sharp contrast with the case of oil, where of course, branding of the oil and the pricing of different brands of oil has been key also in power relationships, including within sub-national units in Russia, which is one of the issues that Bill works on. Because natural gas is lighter than air, it would not move on its own. You cannot simply have natural gas in a pipeline and expect it to move. It will not move. you need to contain it. You need to make sure that it doesn't take over all the space available. And also you need to nudge it to move. You need to compress it. You need to make sure that it can move. And all of this requires very extensive capital investments, even in comparison with the capital investments required with crude oil transportation, for example. If you look, for example, at the issue of pressure, at the pressure of the pipelines, that pressure in the case of natural gas is much higher, needs to be much higher than that in the case of oil. And this has all a lot of different implications, including the quality of the steel that you need to use in natural gas pipelines, the size of those pipes, and the extensive investments you need in, for example, compressor stations. So those impacts have to do with the fact that, as I mentioned in my book, the entire natural gas marketing and production, and in particular sale enterprise, is an enterprise in managing pressure. And here, in fact, the title of my chapter on natural gas is Managing Pressure from Western Siberia to Germany. And this is going to be very, very important, because a lot of the investments in natural gas have to do exactly with managing pressure. A lot of the way in which different actors come into play have to do with managing pressure. Storage becomes really important, because it's very difficult if you cannot store natural gas. Given the fact that you cannot stop production very easily, then you have to let it flare, which is also an important issue, not only economically, but environmentally. This also brings the question of commodification. If you cannot easily store natural gas, can you commodify it? Can you have world size global markets, or do you have regional markets? And also it brings questions of accounting. Historically, in the post-Soviet area, and especially in relations between Russia and some of its consumer states in the former Soviet Union, the accounting of the natural gas used, for example, to power compressor stations, which in some cases was up to 10%, and the natural gas that was actually transited, it was very difficult to separate between them. And the heterogeneity of natural gas has also not been properly accounted for in some of the traditional Soviet and post-Soviet ways of accounting for natural gas. So just in a nutshell, the materiality of natural gas affects many of the ways in which actors coalesce or collide around it, and affects some of the opportunities and risks that are part of that relationship. So when we look at threat and temptation in natural gas, we perhaps are more familiar with the issue of supply cutoffs, price hikes, concessions, lack of alternative supplies. But if you look at the entire framework and the entire trade of natural gas, and in particular participation in those Russian chains of export chains of natural gas, there was also, or there is, the possibility of important gains. Arbitrage gains from price differentials between markets. This is something Ukrainian oligarchs did very successfully in the 1990s. Transit fees, the role of transit in maintaining the domestic gas supply system at the appropriate pressure and working productively. And I mention this because when we are talking about Nord Stream 2, a lot of the discussion about Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1, a lot of the discussion about whether the US should impose sanctions on Nord Stream have to do with the impact on Ukraine. And the impact on Ukraine is first and foremost cutting off Ukraine from participation in the opportunity side of those Russian energy chains. Through the Brotherhood pipeline, which is the pipeline, the natural gas pipeline I analyzed in this book, Ukraine was able not only to access very important transit fees, $1 to $2 billion per year, but also to use that transit to maintain its domestic supply system functioning, and also to play a more important role in European understandings of security because it allowed Ukraine to triangulate its relationship with Russia, given the fact that the European Union was also very interested in maintaining the stability of those supplies. I do not want to say that Ukraine was opportunistically hatching on to Russian energy export chains. Actually, when those Russian, or at that time Soviet, natural gas export chains developed in the early 1980s, Ukraine was essential, an essential central key player, even as a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Those export gains made by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, made by Russia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, would not have been possible without Ukraine. So let me now move a little bit into Nord Stream 2, and just to give you a few basics. Again, there's no way we can cover all the details of this pipeline in half an hour, but a couple of basics. Well, first, it parallels Nord Stream 1 that was inaugurated in 2011 with 55 billion cubic meters of yearly capacity. The US, the project for Nord Stream 2 that would parallel those lines and double that capacity to 110 billion cubic meters per year was very strongly opposed by the US. You had sanctions at the end of 2019, renewed and expanded at the beginning of 2021, which meant that for about 7 months in 2021, the project was frozen because EU companies were participating in the process, and I will talk more about them later, were very afraid that they could be touched by those American sanctions, so construction was suspended. In July of this year, there was a surprising to some, unsurprising to others, agreement between the US and Germany to give a green light to the pipeline. In exchange for what was constructed or presented as some kind of guarantees to Ukraine in the form of guarantees that there will be swift action should Russia attempt to use natural gas or energy as a weapon, in the form of a green fund for Ukraine. Many people say that those guarantees were not enough, but that was what was presented in the US-German declaration in July of 2021, sorry. And as a result of this, the pipeline, the actual building of the pipeline was completed in September, at the end of September, but the pipeline has not yet been certified for operation. And I highlight that, I underline that, because after the building of the pipeline was completed, to the dismay of many in the US and in Ukraine who would have liked to really stop that process, all the focus of those opposing the pipeline has come to focus on certification by the EU for operation. That has not happened, but what has happened, and I think this is kind of how reality catches up with us, and what we didn't know would happen when we scheduled this discussion today, is that the fact that certification has not taken place yet has led to a lot of things happening. Many argue that Russia has started a new campaign of pressure using reduced energy supplies in the last few weeks to push the European Union for certification. And some have argued that Russia is slowly, I guess, slowly getting ready to start using the pipeline even before certification. So a lot of the discussions now are around the issue of certification, and I will be in the next slides discussing that issue within the context of some of the debates taking place in the European Union about energy policy and about relations with Gazprom. When we are talking about market impact of Nord Stream 2, the most important impact is that it is not a source of additional supply to the EU. Basically, what it does, it moves volumes away from other pipelines, in particular the Brotherhood pipeline through Ukraine, and brings them directly to northern Germany. However, the impact is not only on northern Germany, because through a series of pipelines in particular Opal and other pipelines, this natural gas is sent south to close to Vienna, to a major hub, and basically is flooding Central Eastern European countries with this natural gas. And many have argued that it increases Gazprom's market power in Central East Europe. So through this impact, it raises three key issues: whether it's dividing European markets and calling into question issues of solidarity in European Union energy policy, in particular dividing quote unquote old EU member states with new member states. It raises the issue of stranded assets. What happens if Brotherhood through Ukraine is no longer used? What is the impact? And it raises the issue of the environmental impact of the pipeline and of the natural gas that would flow through it. And in particular, concerning the climate impact, since we are under the shadow of Glasgow, I want to emphasize that many people argue that Nord Stream is not compatible with the goal of maintaining a maximum of 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in global temperatures, because it creates additional transit volume. Even if it does not bring in new supplies, it maintains the incentives for fossil fuel supply. The production from which the gas going to Nord Stream 2 is coming is a relatively high carbon footprint production. And it creates a double stranded asset danger, not only the Brotherhood pipeline in Ukraine, which we just discussed, but also Nord Stream itself. Against this view is the view that natural gas may be seen as a bridge. And here we have the wonderful book by Thane Gustafsson, The Bridge, a bridge not only between East and West, but between fossil fuels and renewables. And some have argued that natural gas can play that role, and that is actually a good thing. But not everybody agrees with this. So we often associate Nord Stream 2 with Gazprom. What we need to understand is that Gazprom could do very little without its European partners. And the role these partners have played in Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 is very significant. They have played a role as providers of investment. They have played a role as providers of technology, because Russia only has doesn't have sufficient technology in terms of, for example, pipe laying technology, ships, and it has also played a role in the certificate. They have also played a role in the certification and technical oversight of the pipeline. But at a political level, they have also played a role by making many believe that Nord Stream AG, Nord Stream 2 Aktionsgesellschaft, is not a German company, but an European consortium based in Switzerland. Legally, it is. And the fact that such important European countries are behind it allows many to use that as a cover for what is actually very clearly a Gazprom process. Now, as somebody who has been looking at the development of those pan-European energy markets, those companies are not new names for me. Many of their names have changed through the process of mergers and acquisitions, but these are basically either the direct successors or partial successors of key partners of the Soviet Union in the major campaign to start the large-scale export of natural gas to Western Europe in the 1980s. They have very significant joint interests with Gazprom, because many of them have operate jointly with Gazprom natural gas and oil fields in Russia, and they have been offered very favorable conditions by Gazprom which in many ways have given these companies an interest in remaining in the project, even despite the fact that it is politically and even environmentally and market-wise a contested project. I want to use this opportunity to remind you that many of the issues that we are dealing with here concerning Nord Stream are embedded in issues we have seen in history. And I want just simply to flag in this slide 2 books that have been very, very important for me and for all of those working on this issue for understanding the historical context of Nord Stream. One, and these 2 books were published around 20 years apart. I have the red gas book first in this slide because it deals with an earlier historical period, published in 2013 by my colleague and study group fellow member Per Hoxelius, which is a history of how the Soviet natural gas exports to Western Europe started. Really wonderful book. And the second book is a book by somebody you know very well, Bill Rasinger, Energy and the Soviet Bloc, Alliance Politics After Stalin, which shows us very well how supplies of oil, of natural gas were used also in the management of alliance politics. You may ask, why would that be relevant today? We don't have the Soviet bloc anymore. We don't have Comecon or Crimea anymore, but it's tremendously important because the actors involved may not be the same, but the negotiation of relationships through energy continues. So this provides very important background for understanding some of the dynamics going into those relationships. So a few words about the Russian and European context of these debates. In the Russian context, the domestic context, a key context has to do with governance and corruption. We all know, and it's a running joke among specialists, that whatever may happen to Nord Stream 2, some of its key goals have already been achieved. First and foremost, the fact that key players in Russia, key allies and friends of Vladimir Putin have received their contracts. Key companies, key construction companies have been active in building the pipeline at very high cost, receiving a very good reward for their work. And in many ways, these domestic actors in Russia, which are in turn very closely related to the Russian leadership, are very happy with what is there already, regardless of what may happen later on. But part of the context is also whether Russia will credibly engage in a decarbonization policy. We have contradictory information here. On the one hand, we have Vladimir Putin talking of carbon neutral Russia by 2070 or 60. On the other hand, the actual projections talk of an increase in carbon. So we don't know which of these 2 sides will prevail, but that is an important context, because that is the context in which we are going to see either Russia maintaining the fossil fuel sector as a key sector in the economy or moving to some other sectors. For example, there has been the discussion of whether Russia could produce hydrogen and perhaps export it via Nord Stream. So this is part of the context, a political context, a governance context, but also a climate policy context within Russia. In terms of an external context, I think when we think about Nord Stream, we need to think about some longer-term dynamics, in particular, Russia's long-standing search for direct routes for its fossil fuel exports, not simply for natural gas. We are already, since the mid-1990s, there was a move towards moving natural gas transit away from Ukraine and through Poland and Belarus. And now we see a further step in this direction, but also in the case of oil, where historically the Baltic states, in particular Latvia, played a very important role as transshipment ports, and this has been totally ended by the beginning of projects in Russia, the Baltic Pipeline System 1, pipeline system too, which actually bring that oil to Russian Baltic Sea ports for direct export. But two other important aspects of the external context of Nord Stream have to do with Russia's changing relationship with Ukraine. I'm referring, of course, to the military conflict, as a result of which now today 7% of Ukrainian territory is under Russian control, directly or indirectly. But also I'm referring to the fact that for many years throughout the 1990s and 2010s, there was a de facto agreement between key energy actors, and in particular key natural gas actors in Russia and Ukraine, to jointly carry out dubious governance projects that allow these actors to become rich in exchange of the states, of the Russian state and the Ukrainian state. And this is changing with the military conflict, and this is also changing or will change if Ukraine stops being an important player in that chain of Russian fossil fuel exports. And the final but tremendously important context, external context to Nord Stream 2 has to do with the bifurcated relationship with the EU. On the one hand, the EU as an organization is becoming more and more vocal about the need to have supply diversification in terms of the supply of natural gas and other fuels. On the other hand, the relationship with concrete commercial players such as the companies I mentioned before, Wintershall, NG, Shell, has never been closer. So that kind of bifurcation of relationships is a very important context to Nord Stream from the perspective of Russia's foreign policy and external relationships. Finally, I want to give you a little bit of context in terms of how European Union decision-making concerning Nord Stream 2, and in particular certification of Nord Stream 2, is taking place. And here, it's very important to put the discussion of Nord Stream 2 within a larger context of the various policy goals that the European Union as an institution has been trying to pursue, and how those goals may be coming into clash. Let me start, or let me go back for a moment to the discussion we had a few minutes ago about the physical characteristics of natural gas. Because of the physical characteristics of natural gas, because of the need to keep the system in balance, in particular concerning pressure, and again, this is something I discussed very much in detail in the natural gas section of this book. Natural gas marketing, the natural gas system is characterized by very strong networkness. That is, it needs to work as a network. Now, we could say that everything is a network, but in the case of natural gas, this is very clear. It has very clear safety consequences, not only in terms of security of supply, but in terms of physical safety. If you do not keep pressure in control, if you do not understand pressure as a network-wide issue, you can have very significant accidents, as we saw here in suburbs of Boston 2 years ago, when there was a huge natural gas explosion that killed several people and basically razed half a city. So because of this issue of networkness, natural gas in general has been the most regulated of the fossil fuels in the European Union. Why is that important? Because natural gas has, like no other fossil fuel in the European Union, brought up the tension between national level policies and union level policies, or Brussels policies. And this has been tremendously important, not only in terms of the context in which discussions about Nord Stream 2 take place, but in terms of the very, very complex issue of which laws and which regulations actually do apply to the pipeline or do not apply. And taking a step back, it also brings up the question of which of the European Union's policy goals takes the front seat. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the key word in European Union energy policy, and more broadly in the European Union's regulation of network products policy, was the issue of liberalization, the desire to create a level playing field in the European Union by getting rid of long-term contracts, supporting the liberalization of the natural gas market, allowing quote unquote free competition between suppliers. But that goal is very much, at times, very much in conflict with the issue of supply security, which calls for a more direct role of the EU in making sure that not too large a percentage of the supply basket comes from a single country, as for example, from Russia. And on top of this, in the last 3-4 years, we have decarbonization becoming a key element in European Union policy. And we see these 3 goals of European Union policy affecting the balance between national policy and Brussels policy concerning Nord Stream, and also the way in which these debates take place nationally in each state. All of this is also related to changing views of energy security. If the international community and the European Union, traditionally since the 1973 oil embargo, looked at energy security mainly through the prism of supply, security of supply, there has been a development, a shift towards also understanding the importance of security of demand, so that those producers will want to supply that natural gas or that oil, but also more and more an understanding of the importance of transit security, of securing the role of transit states such as Ukraine, and increasingly the question of climate change security, how to bring these goals in sync with the desire to maintain climate change under control. I'm gonna maybe reduce a little bit the last part of my presentation. I just want to flag that there is a huge debate about the legislative and law-based sources for regulation of Nord Stream 2, which EU regulations apply, which do not apply. Is Gazprom able to sue the European Union or specific countries under Energy Charter Treaty provisions that guarantee investments? These are all very complicated issues, but I'll be happy to discuss them in more detail. An issue here is whether the liberalization provisions of the European Union, more particularly those that emerged around the 2009 gas directive, apply, and in which way, and whether national states have policymaking power over that pipeline, or is it a Brussels prerogative? Nord Stream debates, however, show that both Russia and Ukraine are still tied to one particular view of energy transit, not a liberalized view of energy transit, and not a decarbonized view of energy transit. And I think this is a challenge that tells us that both countries have much thinking to do in this area. I want to wrap it up now, because we have, I'm sure, much to discuss. I thank you for your patience in the last 40 minutes or so, and I'm happy to engage in a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Now we will move on to the Q&A portion of our program. Please submit your questions via the chat function. You can access the chat function by clicking on the chat box icon, which should be located near your audio and video buttons. While we wait for questions to come in, ICFRC thanks its members who have renewed their annual memberships in ICFRC. And we invite those of you who have not yet renewed to do so at icfrc.org. And of course, if you're not a member, we certainly welcome you joining us. ICFRC depends on the financial support of its members and friends to continue to provide high quality international educational programs at no cost to our community. So we appreciate your membership support. All right, so we will now begin questions. Feel free to turn on your video at this time if you'd like, but please remain muted. I think I will use my host's prerogative and ask, what options does Ukraine have if indeed supply of gas through the Brotherhood pipeline is dramatically reduced? How will they be able to keep their domestic distribution network going? And how else will Ukraine be able to adjust to this new reality?
Yes, that's a really, really good question. So there are two aspects to this. One aspect is, or three aspects. One aspect has to do with stranded assets. Another aspect has to do with revenue. A third aspect has to do with domestic supply networks. And let me just briefly mention what could happen in each one. Concerning the issue of stranded assets, like what would Ukraine do with this pipeline? Of course, some have argued that it would be a welcome change because it would allow the corruption that has developed around that pipeline to stop. I think that's not exactly the entire picture, but there have been voices in Ukraine that have argued that Ukraine could revamp the Brotherhood pipeline to export ecologically produced or renewables produced hydrogen. This is also something Russia is considering. There is a lot of work being done in Ukraine on the issue of production of hydrogen, which could be exported, but I think still some work needs to be done about what kind of investments would be needed to really use that existing pipeline for exporting hydrogen. I am not so sure that it would be economically feasible, especially considering that the pipeline is already near the end of its original exploitation term. The second issue has to do with revenue, transit revenue. That is not, I would say that is not the key issue in the short term, because Russia, even when it is already moving supplies away from Ukraine, is paying the penalty, the so-called ship or pay penalty. But obviously that is an issue that would really become much more important in 3 years after the current contract would end. Now, the issue of what does this do to domestic supply is a more serious one, because it's not really possible to maintain the Ukrainian gas network as a supply network of the level that it is today without a higher higher degree of pressure in the pipeline. What I would imagine is that there would need to be some decisions about which parts of the network to continue operating, and some parts which have a lower traffic, lower transit, would need to be separated from the network. But these options are not, none of them are too great. Eventually, Ukraine will need to move to a different source of a different role in European energy chains, a role related to renewables. Here, the joint US-German declaration made some promises, but the question is whether what they have promised, which is in the order of $370 million, whether that is enough.
Great, thank you. The next question asks about the current problems with gas supply in Europe, and it says Russia says it is fulfilling all commercial contracts to the EU. If this is the case, the shortage would appear to be the responsibility of Russian suppliers. How do you view this?
Well, it's I'm following this pretty closely, and it's a little bit hard to know what is exactly happening, because you have very surprising information, such as reverse flows from Germany to Russia, which is not something you see very often. But I do want to go back to the question for a moment and ask the person who's asking, when he or she is asking about the responsibility of Russian suppliers, do you mean suppliers within Russia which are supplying the natural gas, or do you mean suppliers within the target countries? Is there any way we can get back to the question, to the person who asked the question.
Yeah, if we get another entry to the chat, we can do that. While we're waiting for that, we can turn to another question. One person asks for you to comment on the actions and philosophies of Ted Cruz regarding Nord Stream 2. If you're familiar with Ted Cruz's opinion on this.
Well, I'm not necessarily familiar with him in regard to Nord Stream 2, but so maybe we can invite the speaker, the person to give more detail. But I believe that we are talking about the very strong role of US congressmen and women in trying to elicit sanctions against Nord Stream 2. And this was a very, very concerted view. In general, looking at it in hindsight, I think there is much to be said for those sanctions. I think at the time when the discussion was going on earlier this year, perhaps there was in many of us a more rosy view of how Russia would react once it was given the green light. And unfortunately, it has reacted not by becoming a more cooperative player, but a more bullish player seeking to bully European Union markets into certification of Nord Stream 2. But I'm happy to hear more about that question and about Ted Cruz's perspective.
That it sounds like you're touching also on the previous question about whether in fact Russia is playing politics or whether everything that is going on is purely commercial, as President Putin insists.
Yeah, well, it's been tremendously interesting. So in general, I have not been a proponent of simply using the phrase Russian energy weapon. First of all, because I think we cannot simply talk about Russia, we need to talk about specific actors. And secondly, because as I explained very well in this book, you cannot use energy in any way you want. What you can do with energy depends on the technological constraints that every type of energy brings to the fore. Having said this, what we have seen in the last 3 weeks has exceeded any expectations on my part. The fact that, in my view, there has been a possibly artificial shortage situation created by Gazprom. We don't have all the information, we don't have all the data, but it seems to be leading in that direction, which appears to be specifically geared towards making the European Union believe that without those supplies from Nord Stream, it will not be able to survive this winter. And that speaks of pressure. Is it purely commercial pressure? Is it political pressure? There seems to be political pressure. If you look, for example, at what has happened between Moldova and Gazprom, Moldova is a very small country and the poorest country in Europe. Because of a contract dispute, its supplies of natural gas from Gazprom dwindled to about 30% in the last few weeks. Finally, they reached a new agreement with Gazprom, and that agreement that was reached on Friday, that new agreement specifically asks Moldova not to implement European Union natural gas liberalization regulation. So that tends to give me the sense that there is a political element here as well, having to do also with the regulation of natural gas trade, but also with the degree to which European Union governance and governance statutes would also play a role in these states.
Great, thank you. The next question asks about the role that American LNG, liquefied natural gas, can play in Europe's energy security.
Well, it's a great question. And I know that for many in the US, LNG has been seen as a way in which the US could, quote unquote, free Eastern European countries from the dictate of Russian supplies or monopoly of Russian supplies. In fact, I just came upon a quote from, I believe, the Undersecretary of Energy in 1919, making reference to LNG molecules as quote unquote molecules of freedom, which I think is totally fantastic. The reality is a little bit more complicated. The reality has to do with the fact that price-wise, still, even if these are molecules of freedom, the US is not providing them, supplying them for free. And because of the technology involved in LNG gasification, liquidification, and then gasification, and the technology involved, LNG tends to be more expensive than pipeline natural gas supplies. So what we have seen in countries like Lithuania, in countries like Poland, has been the use of LNG, not necessarily to supplant Russian pipeline natural gas, but simply to have an element of bargaining. And if you look at the Lithuanian LNG regasification ship Freedom that was put into operation about 5 years ago, if you look at the Świnoujście LNG terminal in Poland, they are important, but they are not used to full capacity. They are there as a counterweight, waiting to be used if needed. The second element here, which I think is really, really important given the context of our discussions in Glasgow, is that liquefied natural gas is environmentally very problematic. First, we have the entire issue of what is the carbon footprint of the actual production that goes into that liquefied natural gas. Some natural gas from fracking or certain production conditions is actually very carbon intensive. And then on top of that, we have the issue of the energy that is needed to bring that natural gas to very cold temperatures, to liquefy it, and then to regasify it. These are very serious issues having to do, obviously, with the carbon footprint of LNG. And I do not think that for most markets, it's a real alternative. It's an alternative clearly for markets that are not connected to the pipeline system, but I do not think that it's a viable alternative in the long term, in particular because of the ecological impact.
Great. Maybe as our final question to build on that, what are the options that for the United States to provide positive incentives for its European allies to diversify their energy and perhaps decarbonize it in the future? What role can the U.S. play?
Well, the strongest incentive for diversification is, as you very well said, Bill, decarbonization. And here, I think the US can lead also by example. Right now, the European Union is leading here. I think when the US starts taking credible positions, credible policies towards decarbonization, that will support its European Union partners, both domestically and in international fora. And that is really the most important guarantee of reducing reliance on Russian fossil fuels. If that means that Nord Stream 2 will be a stranded asset, if that means that Nord Stream 2 will have to be retooled to perhaps receive hydrogen, let it be. But the only real guarantee of supply security and of diversification is moving to renewables. At least that is my view.
Great, great. Well, we must now conclude our program. On behalf of the ICFRC, I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Margarita Balmaceda for her wonderful presentation and for sharing her expertise with us today. I am privileged to be able to virtually present you with the highly coveted ICFRC mug for coffee, tea, or the beverage of your choice.
Excellent.
We will coordinate delivery details with you
please
soon.
do. I want it. I want it.
Our program next Wednesday will feature Blake Ruppe, who will speak on plastics in the ocean. This program will be held in person and via live streaming. We look forward to seeing everyone there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are adjourned.